Welcome to the recorded live stream of this webinar on the energy efficiency of the road freight sector in Brazil. My name is Jack Miller and I'm an energy efficiency policy analyst at the International Energy Agency. This webinar took place on October 28, 2021 and marked the publication of the joint IEA-EPE benchmarking report on the road freight sector in Brazil. The report can be found in English and in Portuguese on both the IEA and EPE websites. The event will begin in a few short moments with some welcome remarks from Dr. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency at the IEA. Before Brian spoke, we also heard some welcome remarks from Samira Souza, General Coordinator of Energy Efficiency at the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy. Unfortunately, due to a technical hitch, these remarks didn't make it into the recording, but we're grateful to Samira and to her colleagues at MME for their participation in the event. After Brian, you'll hear from our three speakers, who I introduce as we go along. So we very much hope that you enjoy the webinar and find the insights shared during it both interesting and useful in your own work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Samira, very much for your kind words and for being with us today. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, all of you for joining us. We're very pleased to be here, and it's a great pleasure to jointly welcome you to this webinar that's organised between ourselves and the IEA and our good friends in the Brazilian Energy Research Office on this topic of energy efficiency in the Brazilian road freight sector. This is part of our ongoing collaboration between IEA and EPE, and we're very grateful for the close collaboration with our friends in EPE and, of course, with our friends in the Ministry of Mines and Energy as well. We enjoy very much working with our friends in Brazil, as we do in many areas of energy efficiency and much more widely with the IEA. Of course, Brazil is such a key country. It's an important member of the IEA family, key energy consumer in South America, and a key partner that is also commendable for much of the great work it has done on energy efficiency as well as other energy topics. I would highlight, for instance, the great work that Brazil is doing on energy efficiency in appliances and buildings, and also for the very high standards applied to electrical motors. And I particularly want to thank Brazil for joining our COP26 product energy efficiency call to action, which it joined earlier this year, and which we'll be making further announcements about just next week at the COP meeting in Glasgow. We're also very grateful for Brazil's collaboration on data and indicators, and we're very much appreciative of the close work we do with Brazil in terms of understanding the Brazilian situation better in detail, and also being able to add Brazil's data to the global family of data that we house here at the IEA. One topic that we've worked on before, of course, is benchmarking. Last year, we were very pleased to be working with EPE on benchmarking in the cement sector, and we plan further analysis next year in other industrial sectors, including pulp and paper. But this year, in our benchmarking work, we focused on possibly the most important sector, which, of course, is freight. Our analysis here at the IEA shows that, first of all, energy efficiency is a hugely important topic for all countries looking to enhance their energy security, lower their energy costs, and of course, tackle their CO2 emissions from energy. And within energy efficiency, freight is a key opportunity. We see that many countries have very significant energy consumption in the freight sector, and for the most part, it's still relatively rare to have standards or other policies in place for efficiency in freight, which makes it a real opportunity to make gains in terms of lowering costs for the sector, lowering costs for the consumer, and of course, lowering air pollution and carbon emissions. And that's why we're really pleased to be able to work on this study this year to look at benchmarking Brazil's freight sector. And I know you're going to hear some really interesting findings today. And I want to thank my colleagues, Jack and Alison, who have led this work. And of course, Samira, you and all of your colleagues in EPE, and of course our friends in MME. We're delighted to be able to work with you on this topic and delighted to be co-hosting the webinar today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, and of course Samira for those very kind words as well. I'm very pleased to say that we now have interpretation with us, so if you would like to listen to either English or Portuguese, that interpretation is available if you press the relevant button at the bottom of your screen, and you can select either of those two languages or original language. So, without further ado, then, I would like to move on to our first of three speakers. So, Eloise Borges is Director for Oil, Natural Gas and Biofuel Studies at EPE, and it's a real pleasure to have her present to you today. Before joining EPE in May 2020, Eloisa worked for 15 years in the Brazilian National Agency for Petroleum, Natural Gas and Biofuels as a regulation specialist. So, Eloisa, thank you very much for speaking with us today and for introducing the topic. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, Brazil. Good afternoon in Paris. I was like I was already in Paris, but maybe next time. I'm glad to be joining this webinar. It was a great work both from the EPEs and IEA teams, and we are very thrilled and happy with the quality of the collaboration both agencies have been doing for quite a while now. During my presentation, I'll talk very quickly about the Brazilian landscape, and then my colleague Bruno will talk specifically about the work in question. We have already discussed that Samira has pointed out that energy efficiency is a critical tool, both to cut carbon emissions and air pollution in transportation sectors, and to be part of our sustainability strategy. EPE is a federal owned Brazilian company established in 2004. Our main purpose is to provide energy information, studies, and research that support the national energy planning. Our areas of study cover electricity, oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, renewables, oil derivatives, oil products, and energy efficiency. Because of the importance of our work, EPE is a voting member of the National Energy Policy. The idea of the importance of the work we do, we follow guidelines established by the Ministry of Mines and Energy. The main guidelines is to provide the energy sector with three strong pillars: predictability, good governance, and legal and regulatory stability. For those things to work, we must have quality information. So the role of EPE is to provide flexible and timeline studies and reports with unbiased technical, economical, and environmental evidence to support decision-making, public involvement, public policy design that contributes to the coherence, transparency, and credibility of the actions of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. Next slide, please. Well, I'll just jumpstart to the Brazilian energy sector. Just a quick consideration. We have been doing studies on the energy matrix for a while, and the Brazilian energy transition started quite a while ago. Our energy supply is still mostly renewable and will remain so. Our estimates indicate that over the 2030 horizon, around 50% of our energy matrix will be renewable. The world average is at 14–15%. But still, despite of that very good result, we still have around 30% of our energy supply provided by oil and oil products. One big challenge is to grow, to provide the energy for the country to go while remaining renewable. So despite a very high increase on energy demand, we project that the energy demand will grow 28% in the next decade in Brazil. Our energy matrix will remain mostly renewable. Next slide, please. Well, as I said, oil is a big part of it. It's 30% of our energy demand. And this demand comes basically from industry and transportation. Historically, transportation was the main consumer of oil and oil products in Brazil, but industry has surpassed transportation in 2020. We forecast that was a conjunctural, a temporary shift, and we forecast that this position will again reverse once mobility recovers from the COVID-19 shock. When we do a deep look in the oil and oil products demand, most of it comes from the transportation sector, and road transportation in Brazil stands as the biggest oil consumer. And that's why we decided to do a deep dive in the road transportation. How can we improve energy efficiency in order to achieve better results? Next slide, please. Well, as you can see, the energy consumption in the transportation sector has been growing in the past 20 years. The total energy consumption grew 22.2% each year, and that was led by the transportation sector, and especially by the diesel demand in freight transportation. Much of the increase we did a very good job at keeping our matrix renewable with our biofuels program. So part of the increase was supplied by biofuels, but the fossil fuel consumption in the transportation sector grew over 60% in the last 2 decades. Next slide, please. Well, and it will keep going. Our business as usual case forecasts the transportation sector dependence on fossil fuels, so we will need more fuels, and the transportation sector, despite our biofuels policy, despite a very high use of biodiesel, ethanol, we still need mostly fossil fuels. The demand for electricity will go, but mostly due metro and rail expansions. Electromobility for buses and truck fleets are not expected to be really large to displace fossil fuels by 2030. In fact, we do not expect like a high electricity demand in transportation in this decade. Next slide, please. We do expect that demand comes basically from niche markets, so electric buses, delivery fleets and all, but that shouldn't be large enough to displace oil fuels. On the other hand, Brazil is emerging as a major oil producer. We expect that by the end of the decade, Brazil will be among the 5 largest oil producers in the world. We have already, we grew a lot in the past decade, and nowadays in 2021, we are already producing over 3 million barrels per day of oil domestic production. By the end of the decade, we should reach over 5 million barrels per day of oil. Most of this growth is based on already discovered resources, fields that already have final investment decisions. So it's a very firm forecast, led, as you can see, by the pre-salt discoveries, which are a very competitive opportunity when we look at upstream oil and gas. Next slide, please. And our production will grow, and we will position ourselves as a major oil exporter thanks to the efficiency and biofuels. So we expect to supply part of our demand, transportation demand, with biofuels, and to gain some of it, and to gain some of it with efficiency. In this slide, if you look at the no efficiency scenario, the transportation modes would remain equal, no investments on transportation infrastructure, technology would remain the same, so we would still be needing quite a while of domestic oil supply. We do project a modal shift, so no efficiency gain, but a modal transportation. We go from roads to water, railroads, so the systemic efficiency of the transportation sector in general will improve. And the third one, the green one, would be with a full shift plus efficiency gains. So we would consider transportation modes changes and individual efficiency gains in each transportation modes. If you see, if you look at that, that's why this webinar is really important. Our transportation demand growth has a potential to turning the country into a significant fossil fuel importer in the next decade. Brazil is still, in our scenarios, a diesel importer. One way to shift that, to change that scenario, is try to gain efficiency and improve systemic efficiency with transportation mode changes. And that's why this webinar will focus on heavy duty road freight and how can we avoid the worst outcome? How can we avoid that Brazil, despite being a major oil producer, remains dependent on fossil fuel oil products? The answer to that is through efficiency and biofuels. And I believe that's my last slide. And I believe that's what Bruno will explore right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eloisa, for those very interesting insights. And before we go to Bruno, I'd just like to provide a quick reminder to please add some questions and comments in the relevant boxes. So at the bottom of the screen, you will see a chat box. Please add any comments that you would like. Please feel free to say hello. And in the Q&A box, slightly to its left, you will be able to add your questions. Again, those can come in Portuguese or English. So thank you for those. So next then, I'd like to move on to Bruno Stuckart. So Bruno is an energy analyst with EPE and was one of the lead authors of the Freight Benchmarking Report. Bruno's been with EPE for over 6.5 years, and there he provides analysis and advice on the oil and gas and transport sectors. So Bruno, thanks for being with us today. I'll hand over to you now.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you, Eloisa. Well, good morning for us in the Americas, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Bruno Stuckart, and I am energy analyst here at EPE. As Eloisa has explained, EPE is the technical arm of the government and everything that relates to energy. So our objective is to plan ahead so we can warn policymakers about potential future shortages and problems. So that is our main objective. My team is responsible for forecasting energy demand of the transport sector. And it is my privilege here today to talk to you about road freight, since it is such an important sector. We will be doing a deep dive into some of the key points of the sector, and I will show you some of the results we can identify from our model. Next slide, please. Freight transport in Brazil is heavily dependent on trucks and has been for quite some time. If we look at the graph there, it's the freight distribution by mode in the year 2000. 60% of Brazil's transport activity was done by trucks that year. EPE has an integrated transportation model we use to check if our forecasts and estimates are making sense. This is very important since it is very difficult to look at a sector alone. So we will be focusing on trucks here, but we will also talk about other transport modes due to their impact on road freight. So it's an integrated model, so everything depends on one another. So a little bit about Brazil. We live in a continental country here, spanning over 4,000 kilometers from the northernmost point to the southernmost point, and also from east to west. Just for comparison purposes, the continental United States measures 2,500 kilometers from north to south and a little over 4,000 kilometers from east to west. So Brazil's dimensions are really enormous. So this dependence on trucks is largely a result of Brazil's industrialization process. Brazil industrialized it late, only in the second half of the 20th century. And in order to accelerate this process, the country focused its efforts on the automotive sector due to its forwards and backwards linkages. This included a focus on the construction of roads to the detriment of rail investment. Just for comparison purposes, from 1961 to 2000, Brazil lost 173 kilometers per year of railways that were given back and were abandoned. This comparison averaged yearly additions of 630 kilometers from 1877 to 1914. So you see the recent focus over the second half of the century really moved from rail to trucks. But as you likely know, trucks are the least energy efficient transport mode, which is why trucks are responsible for over 90% of energy use in Brazil. Next slide, please. That was in the year 2000, but this reliance has actually only intensified over the past 2 decades. Economic growth after the economy stabilization in the 90s and a commodity boom in the early 2000s stimulated transport-intensive sectors. And investment in rail did recover, as you can see there. And rail transport did grow, especially for mining, but it still hasn't been able to shift enough energy demand from the road sector. And the lion's share of transport demand, especially for agricultural production, was hauled by heavy trucks. So this demand, along with incentives for the acquisition of new trucks, led to a 200% increase in the heavy truck fleet, from 300,000 in 2000 to 1 million in 2020. And that is only the heavy trucks. So it's a very significant growth. The fleet sizes of light and medium trucks also increased, especially due to the consumption boom brought about by an increase in GDP per capita, especially in the beginning of the century. But these haul a lot less cargo and drive a lot less kilometers per year. That is why most of the increase in diesel consumption was due to heavy trucks. And this explains this significant increase in diesel demand over the past 2 decades we can see in this slide. And this also explains the country's diesel demand resilience despite the pandemic over the past 2 years. Mobility, as Luisa explained, was heavily impacted by lockdown, but agricultural production and exports have actually increased over the past 2 years, explaining why diesel demand has already surpassed its pre-COVID levels. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, much of the growth in agriculture over the past 2 decades was due to an increase initially in soy production and then in corn production. So mostly in the Midwest in this map. However, the Midwest is far from Brazil's main ports, and there are very few rail linkages and very few navigable rivers in that region. So during the first few centuries of existence, most of the economic activity and big population centers in Brazil developed along the coast. And the Midwest only started gaining relevance and infrastructure from when the capital was moved from Rio de Janeiro to Brasilia in 1960. Some rail projects to connect the region are under construction, with a few more planned. So over time, this should increase the share of railways. But and when all of these are complete, agricultural production will be able to move north and go down the Amazon River, or go east towards the coast to Bahia, or southeast towards the main port in the main economic center of Brazil. But nowadays, much of the agricultural production in Brazil must drive over 2,000 kilometers to the main ports in the southeast. But even when we take all of these rail projects into consideration that are being programmed, trucks are still forecast to be prevalent over at least the next 10 years. So next slide, please. So this sector's energy demand growth has not gone unnoticed. As you can see, it was a pretty significant increase, and several programs and policies have been implemented over the past 20 years to try to limit the growth in diesel demand. So Brazil is already and has been doing some of the homework required. So even though the country, as mentioned by Mr. Motherway, has no fuel efficiency targets for trucks yet, there have been programs like Rota 2030 that incentivize R&D by local manufacturers, and this tends to trickle down to fuel efficiency. And also the adoption of increasingly more stringent emission standards through Proconvi. The program have also had a significant impact on increasing fuel efficiency. Financing has also been made available for companies and independent truckers to buy new trucks. So that this has stimulated the increase in trucks. So in order to accommodate the production boost, especially in agriculture. And another thing of notice are alternative fuels. These have been very important, especially ethanol and biodiesel, as Elisa has mentioned. This has been able to replace a significant part of fossil fuel demand, and Brazil continues betting on alternative fuels for the future, as can be seen by the PNH2, which is the National Hydrogen Program, and also Combustível do Futuro. If you look at it, it's another program that wants to incentivize R&D and incentivize new fuel adoption, like, for example, HVO and other fuels. Public investments in roads and rails have also impacted the transport sector fuel efficiency by improving road quality, but also by building new railroads. Finally, last but not least, investments in information technology have been reducing bureaucracy and traffic over the past few years, and have also reduced waiting time in ports. So things have been happening, and all of this has had significant impact on reducing fossil fuel demand, reducing the growth of fossil fuel demand, but also improving efficiency, individual efficiency, but also the sector's efficiency. Next slide, please. So, as I just said, all of these programs have had a significant impact on fuel efficiency of new trucks, and this result is particularly impressive if you look at heavy trucks. They have been able to do more kilometers for every liter of diesel over the last 20 years, but this has happened in spite of the increase in biodiesel content in Brazil, that is at 13% now. For those who don't know, biodiesel has a smaller energy content per liter than fossil fuels. So usually that should have the opposite effect, but fuel efficiency has more than made up for that. But not only has the biofuel content increased, but so does payload capacity. If you look at average weighted trucks heavy trucks from the past 20 centuries, their payload capacity has increased significantly from 26 to 30 tons. And despite this increase in tonnage, and despite the increase in the freight haul, trucks have been consuming less diesel for every kilometer. So new trucks are really a lot more efficient than older ones, demanding a lot less energy per ton kilometer. Okay, next slide, please. So as we have seen, fuel efficiency has been getting better. However, a significant portion of the fleet is still outdated and inefficient. Trucks are often used to their 50s in Brazil. And not only that, but exhaust controls only started being implemented in 2000. So trucks sold before that had no control over emissions whatsoever. So these older trucks are responsible for a significant portion of emissions and fuel demand. Only just for information purposes, only 6% of Brazil's active fleet is over 30 years old, but these are responsible for about 50% of total emissions. Next slide, please. And this is a huge opportunity. Our models show that an effective truck fleet renewal program, scrapping every truck over 30 years over the next 10 years, can reduce particulate matter emissions by almost 50% in 2030, and also help saving at least 1 billion liters of diesel per year. Modal shift, as Elisa mentioned, is also very significant. We forecast several new railways in our business as usual scenario, but finishing the construction of all planned railways on top of the ones we already considered over the next 10 years could also save another 1 billion liters of diesel a year. So abandoning projects under construction would mean the opposite, as Elisa showed us. So it could potentially turn Brazil from a large exporter into a net importer. Next slide, please. And so a few of the main takeaways from the road freight sector in Brazil you should keep in mind while Allison compares Brazil's indicators to other indicators is that Brazil freight transport is really greatly dependent on road transport. This dependence has been responsible for increasing fossil fuel demand, significant increases in fossil fuel demand, even though we have invested a lot in biofuels. Policies and programs have already been implemented, and these have increased efficiency, but this has not yet been successful in reversing the growth trend. And a significant part of Brazil's fleet is outdated, and there are still infrastructure gaps, especially in rail networks. So all of this presents an opportunity to increase the sector's energy efficiency. So thank you very much, and back to you, Jack.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruno. That was a really interesting and fascinating insight into the first couple of portions of the report there. So we'll move on then to our final speaker, Alison Pridmore, who's going to unpack some of the international dimensions and policy recommendations of that report then. Alison's an energy analyst with the IEA and another of the lead authors of the report. Alison has been with the Energy Efficiency Division here at the agency as a transport specialist for just over 2 years now, following a previous career in consultancy. Alison, we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Many thanks, Jack, and also thank you, Bruno. And I think that set the scene well for our session, looking at the outcomes of the IEA analysis. Before I start, I'm going to take a step back and talk a bit about benchmarking and why we do it. So as Brian Motherway mentioned at the beginning, benchmarking is key to our work in the E4 programme. And this reflects that it helps policymakers assess the energy efficiency performance of different sectors, of different modes in the wider international context. It helps identify the potential for improvements. It helps promote the sharing of best practice, and we'll talk a bit about case studies, examples of that later in this session. It also opens up opportunities to discuss around the potential for new policies and complementary policies. I think it can also add an emphasis to what we already know, or what we think we know, and I think that will become apparent when I talk through the initial results. So I think placing countries in the context of each other really kind of highlights key opportunities going forward. And I'd just like to say that this analysis has been a really truly collaborative process between the EPE and IEA, and this was highlighted earlier. We worked very closely together to examine what countries to compare. Lots of discussion, lots of background analysis that didn't even make it into the final report around what aspects to look at. Lots of discussions around metrics. So I just think this is kind of really a good start of a kind of continuing relationship on this sector. In terms of the analysis, I'm going to start by looking at Brazil's mode share by energy use. And if we look at the graph in the left-hand side, I think we can take out two kind of key findings. The first is, as Bruno's made clear, is the importance or the kind of the domination of road transport to overall freight energy use. And again, what is also interesting is the role of heavy trucks. And as Bruno talked about, this is apparent within the Brazil context, but it's also kind of hyper apparent when you look at it globally. So we can see that actually in terms of overall energy use by road transport, Brazil it has the highest amongst the countries we compared it with, and heavy trucks are also high. And in the report, which we will flag to participants afterwards, we really tease out again the kind of economic factors at the country level. You know, how exports have sort of shaped this demand. So I think it's a really important conversation to be had around demand. And the second thing, when we're talking about the role of road transport is the role of modal shift, and I think this comes through clearly in Bruno's presentation about the opportunities going there so forward. And on the right hand side, we have a kind of benchmarking of Brazil in the international across a group of international countries, which looks at how on a ton kilometer basis different modes are more or less efficient. And we can see that heavy trucks, perhaps not surprisingly, on a ton kilometer basis, are more efficient than medium trucks. But we can also see the opportunities afforded by a move towards rail and shipping. The second one, and I think this is kind of builds on the points that Bruno flagged around improvements in average fuel economy. And we compared Brazil with a group of other countries to look at how this altered between heavy, medium, and light trucks. And perhaps not surprisingly, loads carried the size and type of vehicle. Brazil has one of the highest fuel uses on a grams per kilometre basis. But I think it also highlights that there are opportunities there, and we will look at this and when we start to explore these kind of findings in a kind of case study context. So we kind of looking at what's happening in Russia, what's happening in the US. We're trying to sort of look at kind of where there are kind of opportunities and lessons to be learned. Again, we looked at the also, I'll take a step back. I mean, one thing that's kind of complementary, we won't go into here because of time, but is the kind of additional infrastructure opportunities. So in the main report, we talk about road quality in Brazil and how that compares with the global perspective. And Brazil has a relatively lower road quality compared with other countries, and we explore what that means in emissions. So I think it's again like some of these are factors that are kind of quite quantitative, and then some of these are kind of additional factors, but they tie in with the points that Bruno was making about the role of different infrastructure at different points in the kind of ongoing program. So again, talking about the age of trucks, again we compare Brazil with a series of other countries, and we find that heavy trucks, it's on a par with Mexico. It has younger trucks than China and India, but older trucks than Canada and the USA. And I know we've just seen this graph, but on the right hand side, but I do like this graph because I think it really makes the point around the variation around averages. And the fact that there is this older fleet. And we were particularly interested in this, as I was saying, the process was very collaborative. It was a case of us very much sharing data, coming up with questions, asking each other more questions. And I kind of think this kind of looking at the age really ties in with the kind of case studies, which I'll talk about now. So we kind of, as I was saying at the beginning, why did we do benchmarking? And it really links in with this kind of trying to understand the global dynamics, trying to look at examples where countries are at the next stage, trying to look at learnings from different countries, learnings that have, kind of outcomes where different countries have tried different policy options. So first of all, we'll look at scrappage, because I think it's clear from both Bruno's presentation and mine the kind of role that older vehicles plays in Brazil. Second, and these two tie in, so older vehicles, removing older vehicles improves your fuel economy, improves your air quality emissions, but also interested in looking more broadly. So there's a growing adoption of fuel economy standards for heavy duty vehicles. So we looked at what action is being taken globally to improve fuel economy and what learnings are emerging from that analysis. And then the final one is the modal shift question. How can we build on the kind of excellent progress that Brazil was already making in modal shift to look at kind of learnings from different perspectives. So scrappage, what is scrappage? Well, it's basically a means of incentivizing freight operators to take their older, more polluting vehicles out of the stock and buy newer, more fuel efficient vehicles. And Brazil has used this approach historically. It's financed individual truckers. It's encouraged kind of facilitation of change. However, this is also met with challenges. So at the time this was implemented, there were not commitments to scrap older units, so these continue operating. At the local level, there have been schemes that have been introduced. However, the budgets and stringency, there are issues around that. So really we're highlighting that Brazil has been open to scrappage historically, but was particularly keen to find out, what was going on at the global level. And in the report, there's a much more detailed, sophisticated version of this slide. But here, for the purposes of presentation, we've just kind of taken the kind of key findings. And this relates to examples from Chile, China, and Mexico, who've all introduced heavy-duty vehicle scrappage schemes historically. And they use different approaches. So China, for example, emphasised the most polluting vehicles. Chile targeted small and micro business owners. Mexico, had really positive outcomes. And there are some learnings that I will talk a bit more about on the next page. But at the kind of country level, the importance of vehicles being seen to be dismantled was key in China. Chile and Mexico, required proof that the vehicle had been in use because that was seen as a particular challenge. Local level programs, can really incentivize, can really provide that sort of targeted hit at, the 6% that we both, myself and Bruno, mentioned earlier. Smaller business owners, however, there are also challenges. Smaller business owners can find it difficult to access credit lines. Difficulties around flexibility, difficulties around sort of subsidies, and those needing to be increased, over time. And so, what did we get in terms of best practice? Well, basically, schemes need to be designed to ensure that they remove only older vehicles that are being driven and replaced with more efficient and low-emitting vehicles. Accountability mechanisms should be leveraged to present reselling, opportunities to ensure that metals coming out of the vehicles can be recycled, really making sure the environmental benefits and job creation opportunities are fully realised. We saw, and we talk a bit more about standards in a minute, but we see that there's the potential between subsidies and standards and the kind of synergies there to maximise the potential of both measures. And one thing again, and I think this kind of came out of the last slide, that we saw that there are challenges, and going forward, looking at finance structures that kind of access some of the harder to reach kind of trucking segments, I think was kind of seen as a key area of further work. And this could include flexible payment plans, relaxation of verification requirements, kind of opportunities there, I think, to build on these outcomes and look at how that can be kind of facilitated going forward. So standards, taking a kind of step back and putting it in Brazil's context, Brazil's heavy-duty vehicles have no fuel efficiency targets yet, but data to sort of facilitate the setting of standards, to facilitate the setting of targets is currently being collected. and longer term and targets for 2032 will be developed once this is completed. But as Bruno also highlighted, action elsewhere has meant that there have been savings in the shorter term. So it's kind of the recognition that sort of policies can have knock-on benefits, even though they're not the kind of intended first-off benefit. But as I was saying, we're looking at the kind of global action, and we've had so we looked at what was being done in terms of fuel economy standards for trucks globally, and over 70% of heavy-duty vehicle sales even, basically have adopted fuel economy. So actually, there's been a real shift over the past kind of 3-4 years where the adoption of fuel economy standards for heavy-duty vehicles is taking place. And as I think comes through in the IEA's Net Zero report, freight, heavy-duty vehicles is seen as an increasing area where efficiency really is needed. We talk about electrification in passenger cars, and obviously electrification for trucks is happening and there's a longer term plan, but there's this real kind of short to medium term importance for efficiency here, and fuel economy standards will play a key role. For benefit of countries that have adopted standards, there's some learnings. This draws on some analysis that ICCT have done, or reviews of sort of outcomes of the standards implemented so far. And again, there's a longer table version in the report, but to synthesize this for the purposes of this presentation, we've got 3 key themes. The first is the importance of ensuring adoption of cost-effective technologies, and we know that there are easy wins. On the right-hand side, we have the easy wins, and it's making sure that the standards are designed in ways in which these easy wins can be facilitated, and that can include the right certification, that can include testing which really understands the real-world emissions associated with these technologies. So there's some learning there about actually, we know these things work. How can we make sure that the standards we set up, you make these things happen? And the second kind of key point was the importance of synergies in a global context. And there's some real discussion, real kind of action going on about, basically how can you standardize, how can you harmonize the way you test these different technologies, and collaboration at the global level. And the aim there is basically to make your technologies more accessible, cheaper, basically manufactured and happening on the ground. And complementing that is a recognition, as we talk about data collection, as we talk about understanding the market, it is a role of vehicle simulation. And here there's action, and Brazil are looking at, I know Brazil from previous discussions are looking at vehicle simulation, and so there's some learnings going on there. And then the final thing, and I think this ties in with the understanding of the importance of trucks, the understanding of actions and standard settings in the short and longer term, is looking at ways in which maximising energy savings can be maximised. And that looks to how your different vehicle types will be covered, when action will be taken on your kind of maybe your lighter vehicle types versus your heavier vehicle types. And there's lots of sort of analysis of the approach, for example, that India and the EU are undertaking. And finally, we've finished with modal shift, and I feel I am repeating myself again here, but this is the in theory pretty version of a table in the report. And we looked at sort of 3 case studies from the United States, Switzerland, and Australia, and 2 looked at kind of rail infrastructure investments. So 2 kind of looked at things that would push modal shift forward, pull modal shift forward. It was kind of a attraction. And then the third looked at road pricing, so maybe more of what we call a stick in terms of action. But they all of these schemes had positive outcomes, and these included the facilitation of intermodal traffic units, so really making sure that the intermodality between trains and trucks can happen. Really, I think for me, which came out and we synthesize at the end, is the importance of multiple benefits. So as Bruno highlighted, the air quality benefits of these changes, the congestion reduction benefits of a modal shift, the CO2 emission, the accident, the accident reduction benefits. I think that came through from looking at these case studies, the need to engage in stakeholders and the need to have the dialogue around the multiple benefits that are sort of realised by such an approach. And to cover the main takeaways, basically benchmarking allows policymakers to assess energy efficiency performance of a sector in the international context. It really helps identify the potential for improvements and identifies areas where learnings around best practice can really be facilitated. As I've discussed, that those kind of nuggets really highlighted where we wanted to look at for our case studies, and these related to action on the age of vehicles, action on fuel economy, and ways in which modal shift can be sort of encouraged. And then we came out with 3 key recommendations relating to these themes. One is around the potential for new scrappage programs and the importance of accountability, and that includes understanding where the vehicles have been used, what will happen when the vehicles are kind of finished with, how the components can be recycled, and the synergies between scrappage and standards. And there are also lots of learnings from fuel economy schemes. How could they have been talking to Brazil's targets going forward, the role of cost-effective technologies, and opportunities from some of the global learnings that have gone on. And then the final one, and kind of highlighting this again, the importance of engagement of key stakeholders to really facilitate modal shift going forward, and the realisation of the conversation around multiple benefits and data collection and understanding will be key. And with that, I think I will pass you back to Jack. And I'm pleased to see that we've got lots of questions coming in. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you to all of our speakers for 3 really interesting talks there. So, as we've mentioned a few times now, we'd love to see your questions in the Q&A box. We're already getting some really interesting ones through. And just to answer one of the questions that has come in already, this recording will be made available online on the IEA's YouTube channel in due course. You'll be pleased to hear. So, without further ado, I would like to ask if all of our speakers could bring their cameras on, please, and we will start with a couple of questions that have come in from Luis in Mexico. So this is a relatively broad question, and it's in 2 halves. So I'd like to take it in 2 halves. So first, it's around kind of hydrogen. So obviously that's a very big issue in the global conversation really on decarbonisation. And just wondering really kind of how that conversation has translated down in Brazil. So kind of what considerations or conversations are happening in Brazil about using green hydrogen in the energy mix as a measure of decarbonisation. So I think I'll start with that kind of overall question first to Heloisa.
Well, thank you, and thanks, Luis, for the question. Let's start stating that hydrogen has already been identified as an important technology for decarbonization in Brazil in our National Energy Plan. We have a long-term National Energy Plan published last year that already brought hydrogen into the mix. However, we are looking at low-carbon hydrogen. We have very good opportunities and a potential for green and for blue hydrogen, also for purple if you consider offshore wind power. So regarding the color, our approach is low carbon hydrogen, not choosing technologies. We have a national energy hydrogen plan that was just approved by the Energy Policy, National Energy Policy Council, CNPE. EPE has also already published a broad study on hydrogen options in Brazil, not only for transportation, but for all sectors. We have been considering how to improve and take that opportunity. In our 10-year energy plan that should be published by the end of this year, we will include a specific hydrogen chapter that will detail hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen potential in Brazil in the next decade, how we see that working and entering our energy mix, and which will be the sources and costs of this alternative. So that was the long answer. The short answer is yes, we are considering it. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Heloisa. And the second half of that question is maybe digging down into transportation systems a little more and including electricity in there as well for good measure. So, you know, a not small question. Have you contemplated changing transportation systems to electric or hydrogen? And maybe we could start with Bruno.
I can just make a quick start on electromobility as well. Sure. Thank you. We do have studies on electromobility, both for light and heavy vehicles, for quite a while as well. In the medium and long-term scenarios, the thing is, and I'll be quite honest with you, our approach towards electromobility tends to be more with niche markets, so maybe bus for city fleets, and some kind of specific markets for light vehicles. We see more of a hybrid penetration in Brazil. But I would like to point out that we have other options. Biofuels, even for road transportation, biodiesel, HVO, we see that as more likely in Brazil. And we also have been studying blue corridors for the use of natural gas for freight transportation. That electromobility for that would be very uneconomical. Bruno.
Yes, just complementing what you said, we're in agreement. Brazil, but Brazil does incentivize electrification per se. There's not a federal specific program, but if you go into some specific programs like BNDES, there are financing lines that give discounted loans to buy renewable energy. There's some cities implementing like restrictions for polluting vehicles. So recently, the sale of electric cars and hybrid cars has been skyrocketing in São Paulo, especially because there are a few exemptions and restrictions for these cheap vehicles, and electrification of smaller trucks, of light trucks, has been increasing also. Exactly because usually cities remove restrictions for these trucks so they can move about more freely during the day. So that has been happening. But what Heloisa also said is we're not seeing that happening for heavy trucks, which is the main consumption in Brazil, because as I explained, when you have to take a 50-ton truck, 70-ton trucks, we have trucks up to 80 tons in Brazil carrying soybeans for 2,000 kilometers. It's nowadays it would be infeasible to do with an electric truck. So Brazil does incentivize electrification, but as Heloisa said, we have options. So Brazil is considering for the long term either hydrogen or renewable fuels or biofuels as being better for heavy trucks than electrification, at least for the next 10 years.
Great, thank you. I'd like to come on to another. So we have a couple of questions here on railway and modal shift towards railway. So specifically around kind of, we've talked today a lot about road freight and HDVs in particular. And an obvious alternative is of course rail freight. And just wondering kind of what some of the barriers maybe in Brazil have been to the investment in and development of new railway lines for freight in the country. So who would like to take that one first? Should I start with Bruno maybe, and should we open the floor after that?
Yes, of course. Actually, Brazil has, if you look at the numbers, Brazil has invested a lot in rails railways over the past 20 years, especially in the beginning of the century, around 2002, 99, 2004. Baki did spend a lot of money on railways, but then you ask me why hasn't this like given results? Well, because Brazil is a huge country. For example, Ferrovia Norte-Sul, it's a railway that crisscrosses Brazil from north to south, is 1,800 kilometers long. So it's basically half of the United States, and it wasn't ready by the time the crisis hit in 2014. In 2008, with the financial crisis happened, then in 14, the oil crisis and the deepening of the Brazilian crisis. So some of these investments were delayed, but the northern part of Ferrovia Norte-Sul just came online in 2018, and the second part is coming online in 2020. So because of these crises in the middle, investments did go down, but right now the government is focusing and spending a lot of energy on giving concessions out so that more railways can be constructed. If you look at we'll share the slides we have with you later. If you look at the modal shift slide, you see a few programs like ProTrilhos, which is to streamline new railway authorizations that has been happening, and the government is renewing contracts so that so in order to incentivize investments now, so that rail lines can become more efficient. So investments have been happening. It's just Brazil is a big country, and these huge projects over 1,000 kilometers long, they take a lot more time to get done.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Okay, so I'd like to come on to a slightly separate question then. So we've talked a lot about scrappage well, Alison has talked a lot about scrappage and provided some really interesting international examples. And I just have a question really about why is scrappage so important? Why is it such a good policy, and how does it improve emissions and fuel efficiency that much? So Alison, could I start with you for that, and then maybe we could come on to anyone else?
I think thank you, Jack. I think the first part of your kind of question, we go back to the graph where we have the older vehicles, and we know that the older vehicles are not fuel efficient and also are greater contributions to air quality pollutants. I think that's the kind of, why do we need this to happen? But the second point is a next stage in our analysis, I think, in some ways, and Bruno, very happy, and others to talk to this as well. Like, actually, what happens when you quantify the impacts? And Bruno, I don't know if you wanted to come in and talk a bit about that from your side.
Yes, of course. As I explained, we did a few studies about the impact of scrappage, and we modeled the emissions. And as I said, emission standards only started to effectively come into place around 2002. So all of these trucks built in the 90s, in the 80s, that are still driving 50, 60,000 kilometers a year, they are huge emitters, and they are very energy inefficient. And also, most of these older trucks belong to independent truckers that don't necessarily have cargo all the time, so they drive around empty a lot. So that reduces the energy efficiency of the fleet. Some things have been happening, like information technology. Some softwares, Uber-like softwares for truckers, have been appearing, so that has improved a bit. So independent truckers have not been driving around so much empty, wasting fuel, which is good, but it still could improve. The government is talking about implementing more programs to improve that even further, but scrappage would be paramount in order to remove these older trucks that emit like 90% more than a truck sold nowadays. So that would be hugely beneficial in terms of accidents, in terms of emissions, in terms of fuel intensity. So it would be, and the government has been discussing how to implement a scrappage program recently. but it would be ideal for them to consider all these little notes Alison gave in her presentation.
Thanks very much. So we have another question here on renewable energy, and obviously renewables being quite broad, and I think we're talking about biofuels here because the question is in reference to Brazil's historic really progress on renewable energy, and asking really how and maybe why has this changed in recent years. So I suppose there's a question there of what initiatives are underway on renewable energy now, and kind of why have we seen a change in recent years. Heloisa, would you like to answer that?
Yes, I'll start by answering that. The short answer is it didn't change. The current government has not taken positions contrary to the transition. It's quite the opposite, in fact. RenovaBio, which is a very great program, was implemented during the current government. Its first year was last year in the UN Energy High-Level Dialogues that just took place in New York in September. Brazil presented an energy compact based on goals and ambitions for decarbonization based on biofuels. We have specific targets, and the target would be to the decarbonization of over 600 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions reduction in the transportation sector through enhancing the bet on biofuels. So we have committed to yearly increase the RenovaBio decarbonization target. We are just finishing a work group that discusses the inclusion of HVO diesel in our energy matrix. We have a few other future program that looks for fuel cells, second generation biofuels, and as ways of decarbonization. That's the future we see. In fact, the bioenergy and biofuels in particular are a key aspect of the Brazilian energy strategy in the short, medium, and long term. Thank you.
Yeah, just complementing Luisa's answer, because last year and this year, ethanol demand and production did go down, but that was not because of some government program. That was conjunction of factors. There was a crop failure in India, and so sugar prices went really high. And most of Brazilian production is flexible, so producers can choose between ethanol and sugar. So sugar prices increased, and then the pandemic hit, and the pandemic hit initially reduced fuel consumption considerably of the automotive sector. So in that context, producers decided to produce a lot more sugar than ethanol, but it was not because of one policy, and that can be easily reversed as soon as sugar prices go down a little bit.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a question for Samira. Obviously, as the general coordinator of energy efficiency at MME, I'd like to ask your view, Samira, on really what you think the role of energy efficiency policies are in this kind of discussion. So, we have a discussion here about modal shift and potential electrification, and that's just for freight. What view does MME take on standards, for example, or other energy efficiency policies in transport?
We can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, Samira, we're having issues. If you could just unplug your microphone and plug it back in, perhaps.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
we hear you. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for the question, Jack. And MME considers that the energy efficiency policies are very important also for the transport sector. we have already had an experience with the labeling program for live vehicles in Brazil. Although it's a voluntary program, for example, if all the producers, all the manufacturers, automotive manufacturers in Brazil are participating in the program. And also, when we talk about of initiatives as Inovar Auto and also now Rota 2030, we are talking about a very engaging programs for the automotive sector. We are starting now with this work, with this report from IEB and IEA to also study the heavy-duty vehicle sector in order also to develop programs for this sector. We have already had the COMPET program that was the program for energy efficiency in the transport sector, and was focused. It had also actions focused on the heavy-duty sector, but the program is now in the phase of restructuring because we are having changes in the program and the governance of the program. So we are studying how to improve the program to come to a new phase and to tackle the opportunities that we are facing now, not only specific with the trucks and heavy-duty vehicles, but also with these other fronts in energy efficiency, as the report says, policies and model differences and in infrastructure investments also. So I think we are very interested in this job.
Thank you very much indeed, Samira, and I think that's a really great final comment and to get a final view there from Samira, and really like to thank all of our esteemed panelists, all of our guests. So Samira Souza, thank you very much, and Brian, who's not here with us now, but thank you, Brian. Thank you, Heloisa Borges. Thank you, Bruno Stuckart, and thank you, Alison Pridmore. Thank you to everyone watching at home. And as we said, as we mentioned, the recording will be made live on, or will be uploaded onto the IEA YouTube channel in due course. So thank you once again for coming, and we hope you found it as interesting as I have. Thank you all.